She was not a soldier. She kept a kettle always warm on a cast-iron stove, a radio tuned low for news, and a dozen habits built around keeping a small house standing through an Ardennes winter. That December, the world beyond her shutters had been a rumor. Speakers in town, a brother-in-law gone away with his boots, farther off thunder in the shape of artillery. On the 17th of December, 1944, the rumor arrived with the staccato cough of engines and the metallic clink of tracks on frozen ruts. The night the engines came, her life narrowed to the size of a single, cold room. She is a fictional composite, a local woman shaped from multiple first-hand accounts of towns like Hansfeld, whose experiences stand for many who watched supply lines and armored columns redraw their lives overnight. She had a name in the kitchen, an apron on a peg, a chipped mug with a hairline crack, curtains the color of dried leaves. Outside, beech trees held frost like lace. Inside, her son, barely a man, had left some weeks before to help unload rail cars farther south. A neighbor's child slept with a toy soldier clenched in a mittened fist. Her routines were simple, and in that simplicity lay her safety. War had, until then, been something that happened along roads far to the east. It was not supposed to come knocking on a house whose greatest drama had been a broken stovepipe and a market day that was too cold to attend. The first sound she noted, before she understood what it meant, was not guns. It was the way the earth hummed under her feet, a low mechanical appetite. Engines came like a migrating animal, thousands of small metal hearts beating in convoy. At first, they were a vague vibration in the window glass. Then the headlights, long lines, one after another, lantern eyes that cut the dark. Men moved among them with a single-mindedness that erased a placid yellage of hedgerows and sled tracks. They came under a German banner, a spear aiming west. The column's officer, known in the patrol reports only as Piper, was not a mythical commander. He was a name scrawled on orders, a man whose men spoke of hunger and haste. They were not an army glowing with confidence. Their tanks and half-tracks moved with that awkward, urgent cadence of a force counting every drop of fuel like gold. For the soldiers, the imperative was plain: find fuel. The Ardennes offensive, still young in its first cold hours, had been planned with speed as its ally. But speed consumes fuel the way hunger consumes bread. And by the time this band reached the hamlet outside her home, many tanks were rolling on the edge of empty. They searched farmhouses and barns with an economy of violence, pry open trunks, overturn wagons, crowd into cellars. What they found in one locked farmyard was the kind of fortune the men allowed themselves to call a miracle. In an alley, beneath a shed's lean roof, they found pyramids of jerry cans stacked like a harvest.
The gleam of metal caught torches in the men's cigarettes. Men who had faced shell fire stopped to stare at the ordinary geometry of supply. Rows of 20-liter cans lined like hunks of winter bread. One sergeant, later to be recorded in a brief account, found shipping manifests stuffed beneath a crate and read a number that made a room of hardened soldiers suck air. Roughly 50,000 gallons, listed for delivery to some forward depot. The number, carried by men who had counted each kilometer with the weight of their fuel gauge, had the gravity of myth. To them, a pile of cans was a promise. Tanks would run, engines would not cough to a halt, the offensive could press on. To the other side, the Americans, whose logistics had become grotesquely abundant, the same supply was prudence made visible. For months, the Allies had built a network of pipes and convoys to keep men and machines moving. Miles of truck routes, nicknamed the Red Ball Express, long stretches of pipeline laid across liberated ground, an industrial rhythm that turned what might have been scarcity into routine delivery. Where a German commander saw a treasure, an American logistics officer saw everyday necessity. The difference in perspective was decisive. She watched all of it from a cracked shutter, the glass jet black with a kind of soot that had nothing to do with her stove. At first, she mistook the metallic clink for the sound of men moving furniture, until a torch beam cut across a canteen and a soldier's breath hitched in a foreign syllable. They moved like people on the edge of collapse, hands shaking, faces too pale, laughter that had become something brittle. They shoved aside a neighbor's woodpile, not to steal heat, but to pry open the flanges of a tractor in case a can was bolted to its frame. They emptied a cellar in 20 minutes that had been 100 years of a family's winter stores. Her choice was immediate and simple: what to hide and whom to trust. The law of small communities is a law of reciprocity, but wartime reverses social currencies. Hiding meant a risk of being discovered and punished. Sharing could save a child's life if a soldier's temper flared. She moved through the room with a practiced economy, slipping a blanket into an attic chest, taking a warm loaf to a neighbor's widow, smoothing the hair of the child sleeping on the hearthstone, and all the while she was watching how men handled fuel. They stamped cans with ink, opened seals with knives, poured the pale, sweet-smelling petrol into funnels, and listened as it ran. The odor filled the night like a bright, dangerous perfume. It set her stomach to clenching. She had smelled lesser combustions, barn hay given to a stove, but this was an exotic, flammable scent that seemed to speak of movement, of distance, of the very thing that made the engines breathe. In a village that had always judged weather and seasons, she learned the smell of supply and its moral consequences.
From a historian's vantage, there are dry sentences that explain why such a pile mattered. From inside a house, there are smaller facts that explain how it felt. Tanks that could barely manage a turn of the road drew like beasts seeking water. Half-tracks were opened and stripped for copper fittings and for the small, brilliant components that could be boiled into new purposes. Men clambered across hedges with stoic hunger. A driver, thin, with Hampshire in his accent and fuel on his gloves, pulled a can open with the same reverence another might have shown a letter from home. Private Ernst Kara, who picked up a discarded American soldier's newspaper and read aloud a headline as if it were a magic message, was heard to say, "If only this keeps moving, we will not die on this road." It was a way of naming hope. Yet the discovery of supplies does not always work the way a romance of the fortuitous implies. The Germans, for all their tactical daring, faced a systemic disadvantage: industrial capacity. The Allies had, by late 1944, built logistics into a machine. The Red Ball Express was more than an evocative name. It was a literal chain of trucks running day and night across hundreds of miles to deliver food, ammunition, and countless gallons of fuel. Pipelines, laid in the months after D-Day and extended across liberated ground, kept a steady spout of kerosene and gasoline flowing toward the forward units. These were not miracles, but engineering, valves, pumps, and men who fixed leaks in the dark. When soldiers in the Ardennes stared at a stack of jerry cans, they saw a solution to an immediate thirst, but the larger problem remained. A single captured depot could give a cavalry of tanks a breath of life, but it could not replace an entire network. The men at the farmyard felt this tension acutely. They piled cans into trucks and half-tracks with a fevered efficiency. They transferred fuel into the tanks of their Panthers and Panzers in improvised funnels, scraping rust and carrying metal into the machines like a priesthood performing a ritual of survival. Some of them cried, Others laughed and spat as if that could flense the fear. A sergeant named Wilhelm Hoffman, whose name appears in later notes as the man who found manifests, recorded more than once the astonishment of seeing organized American abundance. "We felt like children in a granary," one brief entry reads, the handwriting impatient and blurred. Those entries became reference points in after-action accounts, small testaments to how supply could alter morale. Back at her house, the woman did what any neighbor would do. She sheltered those she could. A younger boy banged his forehead on the table and would not stop sobbing. He did not understand the difference between an engine stalling and a life ending. She wrapped him in her husband's old wool and placed a hand over his heart, because in the cold, the only immediate comfort was warmth.
Behind the shutter, a German sergeant turned a flashlight beam past the glass, and a shadow stretched across a photograph on her mantel, a small man in a uniform she had never seen. For a night, photographs became anchors. They were proof that a life had been lived, and that now its frame trembled under foreign lights. Between the small human gestures and the metallic appetite outside, a technical choreography began to unfold. The Germans were gathering what they found, but the Americans had built systems designed to withstand loss. Their engineers had imagined pipelines tunneling across fields, logistic regiments that could reroute fuel through contingency plans, and truck convoys that moved with cadence. Much of that machinery never figured in wartime romance, but it taught a stark lesson. Wars are often decided not by single acts of heroism, but by the ability to keep machines running. At some point in the night, an argument broke out a few houses down the lane. A group of men argued over whether to take a little fuel and leave the rest, or to make a clean sweep. "We need the whole thing," one of them said. Piper's voice, recorded as taut, urgent. "Take everything we can carry." Others argued that holding too much risked a counterattack. In those minutes, the moral calculus of survival turned public and uncertain. Do you strip a village and leave families to freeze, or do you take only what the battle calls for and hope others survive? The women who heard the debate, through shutters and between beams, felt the ethical wind that war sends through the smallest choices. Survival was an arithmetic, liters for engines, bread for children. There were no good answers. When soldiers found the manifests, they did not see paper so much as promise. The documents, brittle, folded, slightly damp from a seller's breath, listed quantities and destinations. 15 drums, Road Depot 4, one line might read. Another, 50,000 gallons scheduled for delivery. The precise number has been repeated in wartime notes and post-war recollections because it captured a contrast. To a force skinned by short supply, 50,000 gallons could seem like a lifeline. For historians, the number needed context. Allied supply systems were delivering, in aggregate, many times that amount across vast networks. But in a moment under a single moon, a pile of cans could bend a man's decisions. The manifest did not make the strategy. It reframed a desperate calculus. The presence of fuel altered more than logistics. It altered behavior. Soldiers who had been disciplined about rationing suddenly abandoned that caution under the bright light of abundance. Engines that had been idle for days were coaxed back to life with splashing, with the kind of frantic optimism that names itself as courage. Men who hours before had been calculating the next ration of bread now found themselves wiping grease from their hands with the same briskness. They shared cigarettes and whispered about long, impossible things, returning home, rebuilt houses, wives and children. It is here, in these small, human counterpoints, that the cold arithmetic of supply collided with ordinary longing. A German officer, Piper, made a pragmatic decision that night. He ordered detachments to carry as much as they could. In the logistics of war, decisions are often pragmatic before they are moral. If machines must run, then people must feed them. The detachment moved like a swarm across yards and inside barns. They dragged a wheeled pump, balanced it on barrels, and ran hose into the tanks of vehicles. They worked quickly, as if hurried by the knowledge that abundance is rarely unattended. Inside her house, the woman felt the village tilt toward a strange gravity. For the first time, she heard the language of war close to her hearth, the ripping of leather, the clank of edge tools, the exacting mutter of men counting liters as if beads on a rosary. Once, a soldier came to her door, and she saw fear and hunger at once in his face. Not the hunger of a man who wanted a meal, but that of a creature who needed the lifeblood of a machine. He asked for a bowl of soup, and then, embarrassed by his own want, held it as if he had been given treasure. Not long after, the village awoke to a different light. A flare from a distant depot disclosed a band of men moving under the sky. The flare flickered like a judgment and made everything look smaller and more vulnerable. The soldiers were not invulnerable. Their tanks still had weak points, and their plans had limits. Yet for several hours, the discovery of a local cache felt like a rewrite. In the byways of men's memories, this would remain a chapter about hope and greed mixing like two oils that never truly combine. But abundance can be a provocation. It can invite not only use, but also denial. When armies sense that a resource will fall into enemy hands, or that holding it will impede withdrawal, they sometimes choose destruction rather than surrender. The calculus is brutal and, to a civilian, bewildering. Burn what you cannot take, so the enemy cannot take it either. The logic is strategic, the effect is human devastation. Barns that stored winter hay might be set to flame. Tanks emptied of their juice might be sunk by sappers with small-shaped charges. The moral frame shifts from preservation to denial. One of the men who wandered into town that night was a young non-commissioned officer who later wrote a terse account. "We found pyramids of jerry cans, and we thought the war had turned." He then wrote in another line that seeing the pyramids felt like standing in a pantry filled with food after weeks of famine. Those words, brief and almost private in their discovery, map onto a public scene of seizure and hurried loading. Men carrying cans seemed almost relieved to be doing the work of saving machines from potential death. The woman understood the idea of denial only later, when the smell of smoke changed. At first, she thought the smoke came from a burnt-out truck or a hearth lit with a tire to produce heat. Then the sky for a sector of the hamlet was lit with an orange that did not belong to sunrise. It belonged to a new kind of winter, a man-made dawn. From a lane away they brought a small ragged drum of what the soldiers called white phosphorus. No civilian would have known that name, but they would have known the effect. It burns fiercely, it is difficult to extinguish, and it eats through materials with a terrible efficiency. Whether the phosphorus was used to light a deliberately set blaze, to clear a depot, or to destroy a captured cache was recorded in fragments and remembered with shame or necessity. In the houses, windows rattled and curtains trembled. At the stove, she folded a shawl tighter against her chest and thought of the child's hair that smelled of hay. There is a certain arithmetic of loss that war insists upon. What is taken for strategy may be taken from the hearth. In the glare of the growing fire, she stepped outside and felt the heat carve a new line across her face. Puffs of ash floated like some wrong snowfall. Whether to flee or stay was not a singular decision, but an ongoing negotiation with fear. Half the neighbors were already puddled at the road's edge with bundles. The other half were rooted to their steps, watching as the light of engines and flame remade their small world. A story is often told in hindsight as if all decisions were neat and inevitable. The night she watched the engines and the jerry cans and the burning depot, decisions were hurried, improvised, and mutual. Men carried cans and cursed when a seam split. Women held children and whispered prayers. An old miller handed over a metal lid that became a funnel, and a boy who had never carried anything heavier than a basket learned to lift a can as if it were a new appendage. The extraordinary, the banal, and the necessary braided together into an instant that would, for many, represent the moment the war took their neighborhood. Beyond the immediate chaos, there were larger currents forming, ones she did not see, but that would, in time, decide the region's fate. Allied supply networks, industrial production, and the capacity to replace lost materiel meant that an abandoned tank left in a ditch would soon be a footnote. What mattered was whether the main arteries remained intact. The captured cache in the village could give a local detachment a day's fuel or a week's worth of movement for a few vehicles, but it could not substitute for a continent-sized logistics system. That was a truth beyond her front door, one that would explain why columns stalled or pushed forward in the days to come. Still, for that night, details were everything.
The way a soldier's hands stained his fingers black with oil, the way the child's toy soldier lay in the mud, half buried in grit, the smell of petrol lodged in curtains and would not wash out for months. The woman picked up a small, dented can after the men had moved on and set it on her table like an altar. It was heavier than she expected, and when she tipped it, a few cold, fast drops slid out and left a dark ring on the wood. In that dark ring she saw for a moment her own life's shape, its smallness, and the sudden scale of forces that had decided to pass through it. The night did not end cleanly. Some men loaded their vehicles and drove off with a new lightness. Others stayed, carrying small comforts as if they must prove their right to exist. The glow on the horizon changed from orange to a dying ember, then to a bruise. In the lanes, people whispered of decisions they had made that would be judged by posterity only when posterity had the time to be indulgent. Morally complicated acts, stealing to feed a machine that would bring home a brother, burning to stall a force that would otherwise overrun a town, were the raw material of years of stories to come. The woman went to bed after a long vigil and slept in fits as fuel and fear rearranged the night. When she woke, ash lay on the doorstep like a gray lace. Upstairs, a curtain was scorched and brittle along one edge. Down the lane, a barn roof had collapsed under either neglect or sabotage. No one spoke much about who had set it alight. A neighbor's dog wandered listlessly, its fur draped with soot. The village had been marked by the night, blackened wood, empty tracks, and the slow bruise of silent machines gone still. And yet the machines were not finished leaving their marks. Men came in the morning with lists and manifests and the exacting need to account for everything they had taken or destroyed. A man named Captain John Brewster, listed in some engineering notes as an officer present near depots, wrote terse lines about quantity and disposition. They carried away logs and recorded serial numbers, not for the sentiment, but because wartime mathematics finds solace in numbers. The manifests mattered after the fact, a record of what had been, a ledger of loss and gain. For the women and children who had watched a lantern glint on a metal can and had known fear, the numbers tried to speak to a calculation that could not measure the quiet, small tragedies of displaced lives. She stood at her window and looked across a scene that had been redrawn by necessity. The smell of fuel remained, a residue in the bedding and on the curtains. Men who had moments before been strangers now nodded at one another with a certain international, exhausted camaraderie. The jerry cans, some emptied, some still full, were stacked against a wall like a ruin's bones. Where engines had been coaxed back to life, tracks cut furrows into fields that the spring would never quite repair.
As the day advanced, dispatches and rumors began to form the shape of a larger picture. People said that the Germans had taken what they could and left what they could not. They had hoped to push farther west, to press an advantage with captured stores. They had been surprised by the scale of Allied logistics in some places and humbled by it in others. The woman listened to neighbors speak in low, urgent tones of movement and of the impending days when troops would either pass through or linger. Her life, once measured by the simple intervals of bread baking and radio listening, had been enrolled into a timetable of supply and retreat. In a narrow lane not far from her home, damaged vehicles sat like disabled animals. A small Sherman, its turret at an odd angle, was abandoned with its gauge frozen in an eternal half-empty. Nearby, a German Panzer's engine block cooled in the morning air. Its driver had left tracks that led to a crowd who had gathered like neophytes around anything that bore the promise of movement. Such images would be repeated across the Ardennes in the days to come. Machines stranded by the absence of fuel, men walking beside their pride until they could no longer bear the weight of their shame. For the woman, the immediate arithmetic of survival reasserted itself quickly. Water for the child, bread that would not go to waste, a place to stay warm for those who had lost roofs. People who had lost livelihoods turned to neighbors for temporary succor. A man who had once owned a small bakery offered pastries to soldiers who paused like transient kings. A widow opened her pantry to those who asked for nothing more than a cup of tea and the faceless humanity of being seen. But the night's events had another echo, quieter and more terrible, the realization that infrastructure could be weaponized. The denial of resources, burning stockpiles, scuttling pipelines, mining supply routes, could prevent a foe's advance, but at the cost of starving the civilian population. The moral burden of that calculus landed on ordinary people whose lives were not military campaigns. When men in charge of a convoy decided to blow a depot rather than let it fall into enemy hands, the blast and the smoke did not discriminate. A thought that read easily on a map became, on the ground, flames licking a child's blanket. Toward midday, a rumor spread that some of the captured fuel had been moved to a larger depot in a neighboring commune. Another rumor said that engineers, American engineers, some whispered, had set fire to certain installations in retreat. The truth of those claims is tangled in reports and counter-reports, but the effect was immediate. The villagers realized that the presence of supply meant not only temporary salvation for machines, but also long-term peril for homes. The woman sat with the neighbor's widow and fished a loop of hair out of a boy's collar.
They did not speak of strategy. They spoke instead of small things: who had bread, who had room, what could be carried in a single trip. Their questions were not historical, they were human. That evening the light was thin and the roads were muddied by the heavy passage of trucks. Men leaned against engines and cleaned their hands with newspaper as if to remove the day's work from the skin. In the square, someone strummed a handful of chords on a battered accordion, and the noise sounded like an apology. The village had become a place where history's large forces were measured in spoons and blankets and in the small, stubborn acts of care. Out beyond the center, at the place where the jerry cans had been gathered, a small committee of men conferred by the light of a lantern. They argued about what to keep and what to destroy should the day turn bad. The decision, when it came, was not a single heroic act, but a string of pragmatic choices: which barrels could be taken, which would slow a retreat, which would risk too much to protect. Men measured risk, and the calculus was cruel. The sun slid down and the air grew sharper. The woman closed her shutters and listened for engines that might never again be friendly. The night that followed was restless and full of small sounds: the creak of a neighbor's cart, footsteps that came then left, the intermittent bark of a dog.
Under the breath of the village there was a new knowledge, slow and gathering. Logistics were not an abstract line on a map, but a living current that passed through houses and bones. If armies fought with rifles and shells, they moved and lived on supplies that were material, the tangle of pipes, the rumble of convoys, and those supplies passed near her windows, leaving behind a residue of choices. War, she understood now, was not only what soldiers did on fields, but what happened when supply lines threaded themselves through a woman's kitchen and left scorch marks on her curtains. In the small hours before dawn, word came that a detachment was preparing to move toward a larger depot. Men loaded the last of the cans onto sleds and trucks with the efficiency of those who had practiced under worse conditions. Some men moved with an abrupt joviality, as if humor could outrun fear. Others were quiet, counting each step as if that might keep fate at bay. The woman wrapped the child warmer and tied his boots tighter, then walked with him to the lane, keeping a hand at his back in case the ground tilted again. They did not speak much. Speech felt inadequate for the things that had been displaced. Just as the first light lifted the trees, a beacon of flame drew a dark rim along the horizon. The road ahead would, for a time, be uncertain. Men checked their maps and their gauges, and the village watched as the engines started, then fell oddly silent, as if listening to the world's next breath.
In the silence, the woman thought of a single, scarred curtain and of the dark ring on her table where fuel had dripped. Those small, stubborn larks are the things that history often leaves behind, objects that carry the memory of a night when supply and desperation met, and when a civilian found her life rearranged, irreversibly, by the weight of metal and the smell of petrol. She did not know then that what had happened in the village would be retold in reports and diaries, that names like Piper would be inked into military pages, and that manifests would become footnotes in larger studies of the Ardennes. She only knew, with an intimacy sharpened by the night's events, that her house had been crossed by the logistical arteries of war, and that those arteries carried both the possibility of movement and the seeds of destruction. At dawn, a figure walked toward the depot where the cans had been stacked. He paused, hand on a can's handle, and looked back toward the town, toward the line of houses whose chimneys were sending up thin threads of smoke. For a heartbeat, he considered the human faces the night had confronted: a woman by a stove, a child tightly wrapped, a neighbor with a worried look. Then he turned his head toward the convoy, and his decision tightened into action. Men moved with new purpose. Sparks met metal. A match may have struck. Somewhere the bite of phosphorus found tinder. The sound that rose then was not the heroic firing of guns, but the pitiless chorus of ignition. A dozen small points catching, and then a roar widening like the mouth of a furnace. Curtains blazed, sheds flared, and that winter dawn burned with a hunger no one had wanted to feed. The woman backed from the window and covered the child's ears, though the sound was not wholly to be muffled. She had known loss was possible. She had not known how quickly it could be made manifest in soot and heat. As flame began to lift skyward, men who had sought to drink life from the cans now watched as life turned to ruin. The depot's gleam became a pillar of smoke, and the village was cast in a light that changed everything. It was a spectacle of destruction and survival, braided tightly into one brutal spectacle, and it would leave marks on everyone who had survived it. The woman held the child and leaned against the doorframe, listening to the heat press against the window panes, and felt the irrevocable weight of what the night had set in motion. The fire was not a single thing that happened and then stopped. It was an event that unreeled into many small, enduring truths.
As the depot burned, the night's light crawled across roofs and gutters and painted every face with a temporary, accusatory gold. Men who had fought before and men who had never held a gun watched the same spectacle, and each read it differently, as victory, as loss, as necessity, as sin.
The woman pressed the child closer and felt the heat press at the glass until her window panes seemed like the skin of the world itself, tense, trembling, and easily broken. If this scene matters to you, if you want more stories that place a single life at the center of vast historical forces, subscribe and stay with us as we follow what came next. When the flames finally fell into smoke, the hamlet was a changed place. Scorched thatch, singed curtains, and the scent of petrol in doorways were the ledger by which people counted loss. The depot's black column of smoke drifted inland for hours. When it thinned, what remained were heaps of twisted metal, charred timbers, and the hollow skeletons of jerry cans whose sides had collapsed like old fruit. Men moved among the ruin with the mechanical detachment of those who must now catalog everything that had been useful and everything that had been destroyed. The woman stepped into the street not because the crisis was over, but because a new one, colder and longer, had arrived. The child's breath steamed in the winter air. Neighbors handed each other blankets. A man with a baker's hands split a loaf and distributed pieces like tokens of solidarity. A long, quiet inventory began. Some vehicles were stripped of any usable fittings and left with turret doors open to the sky. Others were pushed into hedges and stood as mute, abandoned wagers in a war decided, increasingly, by whether fuel could be found. Piper, whose name would later appear in dispatches and whose decisions that night would be cited in accounts, stood at the edge of the depot's ruin and watched men load what they could salvage into waiting vehicles. There was, in survivor notes, an image of him with a folded map and a cigarette extinguished between his fingers, the face of a man measuring distance by time and time by fuel. He had made choices that night with the logic of an officer who knew that delay meant the loss of momentum. Mobility had always been the currency of his plan. But the calculus that drove a campaign must deal with scarcity and with abundance, and where one side could replace burned barrels with pipelines and convoys, the other side could not. In the days that followed, the scene in the village became a small theater for larger argument about the nature of modern war. Military reports would later stress that mechanized offensives required uninterrupted fuel flows. Without them, tanks could not advance. Armored columns would stall, and brigades would be stranded like fish on a bank. Local experience told the same story on a human scale. An immobilized panzer was less a symbol of German engineering than a metal husk whose men now walked under cold sky, boots crunching over frosted leaves. The woman found herself swept into the aftermath in ways she could not have imagined that first night. She lent her kitchen to a pair of exhausted soldiers who needed to dry gloves and mend boots. She boiled water for the wounded who staggered in, near to fainting more from cold than from the cuts they carried. She was not unique in these acts. Whole neighborhoods reconstituted themselves into networks of care. The social fabric that war shredded was often remade, moment by small moment, by neighbors trading shelter and soup. At the same time, official men with clipboards moved through the lanes, noting serial numbers and vehicle identities. Captain John Brewster, whose name appears in some engineering notes as an officer involved in depot operations, was seen pacing with men who kept accounts. They did not offer consolation. Their business was with records. For the villagers, these lists were both proof and abstraction. Proof that the world kept an account, and abstraction in the face of soot-streaked curtains that no ledger could repair. The depot's destruction had immediate tactical consequences. Vehicles left behind without fuel remained where they stalled. Crews scuttled hardware they could not move. In the narrow roads of the Ardennes, the loss of a few tanks could break the momentum of a spearhead. The Germans needed to reach key crossroads and bridges before Allied reserves could be moved in. Fuel shortages slowed advances and forced units to dismount and proceed on foot, where the numerical and artillery advantage of the Allies could be brought to bear. The image of men walking alongside the iron frames of their pride, boots slapping ice and mud, would be repeated across the front and would become a tangible index of an offensive that began with boldness but was ultimately blunted. Women in the village, some who had huddled behind curtains and others who had stood at doorways to hold crying children, began to exchange quiet assessments of what the night had cost. One older woman pointed to the soot on a child's sleeve and said simply, "It will not leave." She was right. The residue of petrol and smoke lingered on skin and fabric. It would be a material memory carried into weeks of laundry and conversations, a stubborn reminder that fronts can pass through bedrooms. The moral questions hung in the air, unanswered and urgent. Soldiers had taken what they needed. Soldiers had also burned what they could not carry. Decisions that commanders made under pressure, destroy rather than allow capture, rippled down into the lives of men and women who had no part in those calculations. We destroyed what we could not take, an account would later read, clinical and unrepentant. To sit with such statements in a kitchen and feel the heat press on glazed teacups gives them a different weight. As relief columns from the Allied side moved to stem the German push, the operational truth became clearer. Overwhelming industrial capacity and logistics trumped temporary tactical advantages gained on narrow fronts. Allied units could bring up fuel and spare parts. They could replace what was lost faster than the Germans could capture or burn it. This was not an abstract strategic axiom, but a lived reality for those villages that saw tanks arrive and then stop. An American mechanic's diary entry from the period, brief, exacting, notes the relief that came with each convoy. Here fuel, engines run, men move. Beyond the immediate military arc, the night changed social relations. The woman, who had been ordinary before the engines opened a breach into her life, found that neighbors now expected her to remember and to testify. Men who had been polite strangers a week before now asked for a place to leave a bundle of tools or to dry shirts. A child who had slept with a toy soldier now kept it with a ritual care, setting it on a windowsill like a small talisman. The house itself had acquired new significance, not only as shelter, but as archive. When strangers left, they sometimes left small things, an oil-stained glove, a string of beads, a scrap of paper folded into a pocket. These objects were the fabric of a different history, one stitched from the everyday remnants of war. In weeks that followed, the lines on a map shifted and were rewritten by supply lines and by the capacity to sustain movement. The Ardennes offensive, though initially bold, was hampered by logistical deficits that could not be fixed by local windfalls. Historians would point to many elements, weather, intelligence, the tenacity of Allied resistance, but logistical insufficiency is repeatedly prominent in the accounts. A force that cannot feed its machines cannot expect those machines to win it victory, no matter the daring of its crews. For the woman, the long-term consequences were now part of a daily routine, repairing a singed curtain, bargaining for coal to heat the stove,
telling a child that their father had been moved for safety. These were the languages she now practiced. She kept, in a small tin beneath the counter, a dented can that had once held petrol.
It was not ostentatious. It was simply there, a weight and a memory. Sometimes she would open it and let a small breath of the past rise, as if by inhaling the history she could make sense of it. The smell fixed her to a night that had reoriented everything: calendars, relationships, the idea of home. More than practical repairs, there was a new, quieter reckoning with what it meant to be on the margin of industrial war. The village's life, its barns, its stovepipes, its routine of market days, had collided with a mode of warfare predicated on supply chains and fuel throughput. The people who had once measured time by seasons had to learn to measure time by convoys and by the rumor of pipeline repairs. That learning was not only technical, it was existential. It altered how they thought about security, about the possibility that a future might be decided in distant ports and factories, far from the hearth. Not all consequences were immediate. Months later, when the snow had thawed and fields were showing the first green of spring, a man in uniform passed by the woman's home and nodded in a way that acknowledged both kinship and rupture. He had a burned scar across one knuckle and a look of unfamiliar tenderness in his eyes. He paused on the doorstep, asked if the child was safe, and placed, without ceremony, a small bundle of papers on the table. They were not formal records. They were letters, hastily folded, that a soldier had neither time nor occasion to post. The woman kept them like a small litany. In them were names and promises that would be fragile in the retelling, but solid in the day-to-day care of living. Scholarship in years to come would analyze the Ardennes offensive and emphasize the decisive role of logistics, how pipelines and convoys allowed Allied forces to replace lost materiel, how the sheer scale of production underpinned operational sustainability, how the ability to deny resources, even at the cost of civilian hardship, shaped tactical choices. Those discussions are true and necessary, but they risk abstracting a human core, the impulse to survive that moves through a person who wraps a child in a father's coat and who, in the morning, sifts ash from the threshold and decides, silently, that life will continue. The woman's life continued. She baked loaves for neighbors, sewed mittens, mended boots for soldiers who asked with an embarrassed humility. She planted a small window box in spring and tended it with a fierce patience, as if to prove to herself that green could reassert itself even where black stains remained. To care in that world was not to forget what had happened, but to build small daily resistances to the way war remade possibility. In private moments, she thought of wheels and engines, and of the large abstract maps that had unexpectedly chosen to cut through her street. She did not pretend to understand supply algebra or the technical brilliance of pipelines.
She understood instead the more intimate arithmetic, how many hours it took to bake bread, how much coal would last a family through a week, how the absence of a single drum could still create a ruin. This was her ledger, and she kept it alongside the official ones the officers carried. Years later, historians would write about that night as a junction, a place where logistics showed its face as destiny. They would mention names, Piper among them, and note manifests and quantities. They would place the village, the depot, and the burned cans in footnotes and appendices. That is history's necessary work. But memory kept other things: a soot-streaked curtain folded into a trunk, the dented can on the windowsill, a child's toy soldier that never again saw play, but sat as a witness to a night when supply and desperation braided together. The final image is simple and stubborn. In her kitchen, the woman,
older now, with a line of soot still visible at the corner of one eye, wipes the kettle and sets it back on the stove. The dented can is on the table. Outside the window, the road still curves the way it always had, and the beech trees hold frost in the mornings like a memory of that first winter. No single act of valor or strategy can fully explain the sweep of history. Yet the night the engines came into the hamlet and the depot burned offers a concentrated lesson. Wars are as much won and lost in pump houses and pipelines, in convoys and manifests, as they are on the ground where tanks meet earth. Her house stands, a scar and a shelter both. The soot will fade from the curtains with time and many washings, but the ring on the table, where a few drops of petrol once fell, will never quite disappear from the wood. It is a quiet relic, and within it is a stubborn truth. The forces that ruled continents passed, for a night, through a woman's window and through the shape of a small domestic life. Logistics had written their sentence across her world. She had to live with the lines, and in her living, to replot a course forward. If you want to explore more about the networks that made modern war possible, the Red Ball Express, the pipelines that crossed continents, and the human stories that lived under their shadow, there are links in the description to deeper dives and personal accounts from the Ardennes. Share this with someone who cares about the human side of history.